Today, in the world of religion and government and secret societies, there's a very important facet to the connection between governments and religions by secret societies, and that is the use of the planet Saturn. Saturn is referred to in the ancient world as Lord of the Rings. Well, of course, he is the Lord of the Rings. And men were told to, when they get married, to get married before your Lord, and you wear a wedding ring. Circles and rings were used in different religious events. In order to show you the importance of the planet Saturn in religion, generally speaking, throughout the world, I think it would be appropriate to give you some ideas about the original Hebrew religion and where it came from, and then how it has progressed over the years until today. Saturn dominates the Hebrew religion. It also dominates many of the other religions of the world in the Middle East. Originally, there was ancient religion, but it wasn't Hebrew or Jewish. Going back to the Middle East, we find that it was probably more Egyptian than it was Jewish. But the Jewish people, or what we call the Jewish people back then, at that time, the dominating worship at the time in Egypt and the whole Middle East was the worship of the moon. And moon worship was very important. The Egyptians especially put a lot of importance on the worship of the moon. Well, the moon god, if you are in Egypt and you're looking east, in the middle of the Sinai desert is an enormously high mountain range. And so the people on the Egyptian side of the Sinai would look eastward, and every evening about 6 o'clock, the moon would come up from the mountain. The moon became known as the old man of the mountain. And the moon name, the old man's name was Sin. S-I-N was the name of a moon god to the ancient world in the Middle East. And the mountain was Ai, so you put the two together, Sin and Ai, because Mount Sinai. Well, that's where Mount Sinai is said to be, is in the Sinai desert. And this is why the Hebrews today, as they did many hundreds of years ago, they have a lunar calendar based on the moon. They trace their beginnings of each day from sundown to sundown. Why? Because that's when the moon comes out, is from sundown to sundown. First of all was the moon. Later on, Jupiter comes into the picture in ancient Hebrew worship. Jupiter, because in the ancient world, Pater, P-A-T-A-R, or P-A-T-E-R. And in the Phoenician Canaanite language, it was a Piter, P-I-T-E-R. The ancient name for the Jews was I-U. In the King's English, the old King's English, for the word Jew. It wasn't spelled J-E-W, it was spelled I-U or I-O-U. So I-U was Jew, and Pater was the father. So it became known as the father of the Jews was I-U Pater, where I's and J's are interchangeable. So now it becomes J-U Pater, or Jupiter. Jupiter now becomes very important in the Jewish religion, and then from the changing of the astrological age of Aries, from blowing the ram's horn, to Pisces, you now move into the Christian age. Today, we have, in the Vatican, we have a statue of St. Peter. No, it's not Peter, it's Pater, Father God, Pater. And you put J-U in front of it, it becomes Jupater. That's at the beginning of the Christian dispensation. And now, within the last 500 years, 400 or 500 years, Jupiter has now been eclipsed and has kind of gone into quiet. And now the main planet today is Saturn. Saturn is referred to as the Lord of the Rings. And as we said, that Saturn is today actually the god of the Hebrews today. In the old Phoenician Canaanite language, you spell the name Saturn, S-H-A-B-B-A-T-H, Shabbat. And so if you're going to worship the planet Saturn, the Shabbat, you do it on something called the Sabbath. So when you hear in the Ten Commandments, remember to keep holy the Sabbath. Sabbath is the Phoenician name for the planet Saturn. Saturn, as a god, was always called the god of the black robe. Black is a very important color in both Judaism and the Catholic Church and Christianity because black represents Saturn. Saturn is the god who is a judge of all mankind. That's why judges in courtrooms wear a black robe. Shabbat also has another interpretation. Saturn is the seventh planet. He's also sometimes represented as the Grim Reaper, Father Time. Very interesting, all the little details about Saturn and its numbers applying to it and the colors and all of that. And we get our idea about chronology from Saturn, so we have something called a calendar, chronia, the calendar. Saturn was Chronos in Greek. Another reason why Saturn was important is because Saturn was understood to be the inhibitor, one who holds you back in life. That's why when you are celebrating your God on the Sabbath, you do no work. Because the ancients said if Saturn is the inhibitor who holds us back, then we won't do anything. He doesn't have to hold us back. We'll just not do anything on Sabbath. The reason why that Saturn became known as the inhibitor, and because it circled, ancient man didn't know there were any other planets out past Saturn, so they assumed that he's the bottom line. He's the one that holds us together. Saturn is still important in Middle Eastern religions, Arabic religions. The Star of David is a six-pointed star. Well, a six-pointed star is actually referred to by the reference works as a hex, a hexagram. Hex simply means six, which incidentally, in the Bible, 6 is the number of a man. How do you spell six in Latin? It's sex, S-E-X. So 6 is a six-pointed star. And today the Jews call it the Star of David, but the encyclopedias will show you that a six-pointed star is a hex, and it will tell you that it was originally the star of Saturn. So in the ancient world, some of the priests would draw a circle on the ground and draw a triangle, and then they would put another triangle obverse going the other way, which makes it a six-pointed star, and then they would be able to step inside of the circle and into the star and cast a spell on you. And so the idea was they put the hex on you. In 1977, NASA sent out the Voyager, and as that probe moved out into space, it passed over Saturn. And as it passed over Saturn, it happened to go close to the North Pole of Saturn. For some reason, on the North Pole of Saturn is a hexagram, a six-pointed hexagram on the North Pole of Saturn. Scientists cannot explain how there is a six-pointed star on the North Pole of Saturn, and what's even worse to try and explain is how come the Jews knew that Saturn was connected to 6 in a hexagram. Somehow or another the Jews knew that six-pointed star was somehow connected to Saturn. There was no way for us to know until 1977 when the space probe went across. NASA had to explain to us that it was simply a fluke. It was something that just happened, nothing to be concerned about. Then like 40 years later, when the Cassini craft goes out, that same hexagram is still there on Saturn. It wasn't just a little fluke. It's there on Saturn even today. In the motion picture Lord of the Rings, Sauron is portrayed as an evil eye. If you go to the South Pole of Saturn, you will see what as altogether looks like an eye, the all-seeing eye. However, if you think about the planet Saturn with its rings, if you turn the angle just right, now the rings look like two separate eyelids with the center circle as the eye. So there's a lot of mysticism connected to the planet Saturn, the Jewish religion, the Catholic Church and the Catholic religion. Even Islam today has a symbol of Saturn that is dominantly important to Islam. It was a black square or a black cube. And the black cube represents the planet Saturn. Well, that's what Mecca is in Saudi Arabia, is a black cube, a black square. All over the world, large black cubes in architecture and churches and monasteries, huge black square cubes, just like Mecca. In the movie 2001, Space Odyssey, in the book, the original book that gave birth to the movie, in the book, it was the astronauts were going to the planet Saturn to find this black cube. There again is the black cube in the planet Saturn.